So far in integrated rangeland management here at the University of Idaho, we've covered some of the basic principles of how plants and ecosystems respond to disturbance. We've also talked about some basic principles about how animals meet their energy demands. So whether those be domestic or wild animals, how do they make a living out on the range? Today we're going to turn our attention to herbivore intake. Before you start to manage rangelands and set animal stocking rates or manage land for wildlife, you need to know how much they eat. So you need to know whether the supply of forage that is on the land you manage is adequate for herbivores. So that's where we're going to go with this discussion on herbivore intake. Most of the information that we're going to talk about today is in an article called Understanding Forage Intake in Rangeland Animals. It's on the web, on the class web page, which is Integrated Rangeland Management at www.rem456.wordpress.com. And if you get a chance to look at the readings section on this web page, you'll find this article. So think about it. What are the factors about the plant, the animal, or the ecosystem that might influence how much animals need to eat in any one day or any season? So I've given it away a little bit because I've talked about the fact that it's an influence of animal factors such as herbivore size and species, and also their physiological state. But many of the factors that influence how much animals eat are more or less forage and environment factors. So the article outlines all of these points, and I'm just going to quickly go over them today in this lecture. Before I get going too far, I really want to re-emphasize why herbivore species is so important. So let's talk about ruminants, such as cattle, versus non-ruminants or hindgut fermenters, such as horses. Because of their digestive system, they have very different intake requirements. It has mostly to do with how quickly they can process and move fiber through their system. So ruminants, such as cattle, have very low passage rates. So it takes them about 80 hours from the time when they eat forage to when they pass it through the system, process it, get whatever they're going to get out of it, and pass it out onto the ground in feces. Whereas non-ruminants, especially hindgut fermenters such as horses, they take almost half the time. 48 hours would be a rate of passage for a large horse. They eat the food, they pass it through very quickly, and that different rate is very important. So when forage is where there's not a lot of forage available and it's of moderate quality, then the ruminant digestive system is an advantage because animals can process the forage slowly, they can take out most all of the nutrients. And furthermore, so they process it more effectively, and furthermore, they have microbes in their rumen, which is right before their small intestines and their true stomach. So they actually can use those microbes as a form of energy and vitamin B, etc. So they're more efficient at low quality forage or moderate quality forage, but if it's really, really low, they have to just sit around and process it because they have this orifice. They can't pass things out of their rumen very easily, so they have to process it and get it down to a really low really low particle size before they can pass it on. So they have to keep regurgitating it, chewing their cud, processing that fiber before it can pass through the system. Horses, on the other hand, and hindgut fermenters use a very different strategy. They simply eat it, they pass it through very quickly. So they just take the very best and they pass on the rest. So that higher passage rate, and because of their digestive system, they can really pass it through quickly. The disadvantage is if forage is not highly available, they may not be able to eat enough to actually implement that strategy. And furthermore, because they're fermenting and getting energy out of the forage after it passes the small intestines, they can't use the rumen microbes as a source of protein, unless, of course, they practice caprophagy, which is eating their own feces. Otherwise, they deposit feces that has lots of in this case, hindgut microbes, and they can't take use of the protein that's in those microbial bodies. Interestingly, the microbes and the process of fermentation is very much the same between hindgut fermenters and ruminants. It's just that in the case of ruminants, they can actually digest those rumen microbial bodies. Okay, so what does that mean to the intake topic of today? Again, horses have much faster passage rate, almost half that of cattle, and horses can eat a lot of forage and pass it through very quickly. And the result is that horses eat about 70% more than ruminants do. So for an animal, if you had a horse and a cow at the same body weight, if you had a 1,000-pound cow, she would eat about 25 pounds a day. That same 1,000-pound horse would eat about 42 pounds per day. It's pretty significant difference. And then again, as I mentioned, cattle have the advantage of being able to digest the rumen microbes as a source of protein and vitamin B. So intake does vary by the kind of digestive system an animal has, but also by their size. Of course, it's not really surprising that large animals eat more than small animals. They have much higher demand, and so they really have to supply up many more pounds of body weight. So we have what we call intake factors, and we just predict how much an animal will eat as a percent of their body weight. Most often in this class, we're going to use numbers between 2 and 4%. That would be pretty normal for range animals, whether they be ruminants or hindgut fermenters. Again, I'm going to start by saying now we usually talk about ruminants eating about 2.5% of their body weight, and non-ruminants or hindgut fermenters like horses eating 3 to 3.5% of their body weight. Another influence of body size is that smaller ruminants eat a greater proportion of their body weight per day. So a small animal has to eat a larger percentage of its body weight each day just because it has greater nutrient requirements per body weight than larger animals. So an example might be a very large ruminant like an American bison or a Cape bison from Africa. They have pretty low requirements per unit of body size because they're very large. They don't have as much surface area. They can really eat 1.5 to 2% of their body weight per day and survive if the forage is adequate. A very small ruminant like a dik-dik or some of the very small antelopes that survive in Africa, they have very high energy requirements per unit of body weight, and therefore they need to eat quite a lot more per unit of body weight than large ruminants. Here's what that might look like just for some of the domestic and wild ruminants that we manage in North America. So a fairly large ruminant, such as a cow or an elk, it's 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, would eat about 2.5% of their body weight per day. That's their intake factor, so percent of live weight. A smaller animal might need to eat 3% of its body weight. A very small animal like an antelope or a deer or sheep, that's 100 to 500 pounds per day, needs to eat nearly 3.5% of their body weight. So that's just kind of the range that we're talking about, which is actually pretty significant when you start to add that up over quite a few acres and animals. Again, here would be an example of sheep that I'm just going to kind of focus on sheep and cattle because they're pretty easy to envision. A sheep might be 125 to 150 pounds. They eat 3.5% of their body weight, whereas a 1,000-pound beef cow would eat about 2.5% of her body weight. Smaller animals like goats eat 4%. And deer, mule deer, and whitetail both would eat about 3.5%. Keep those numbers in mind. In class, we're going to simplify a lot of the intake factors. So now we've talked about the fact that body size, type of animal might influence how much they eat. Another really important factor that influences how much animals eat is their physiological state. Of course, we've already talked about the time of greatest demand for nutrients is during lactation. So that is also the time when we might expect greater intake. In fact, an animal can eat 35 to 50% more forage when they're lactating than when they're dry. So that's a pretty important factor. Intake is generally declines in late lactation, but then it increases again as soon as the animal has gone through partition and had the lamb or kid or goat. So that begs a question. Why would intake decline in late lactation? That's when the fetus is growing inside of the animal. You'd think there would be a lot of energy demand, and there is, but also with that growth of the fetus, it decreases the rumen size. or the gut size of the animal. So therefore, we often see sort of a dip in intake right before the calf or lamb or kid is born. Also, we know that higher estrogen levels might be present at that time, and that often increases appetite. So this is a graph that's shown in the in our reading for today, and when you have a period of during the first third of pregnancy, the middle third of pregnancy, first, middle, and late pregnancy, and then when the lamb or kid or goat is, or the lamb or kiss, yes, fine, stop. Okay, so now let's put these concepts together with how they may relate to how forage quality changes throughout the year. We've drawn this graph quite a few times. When we're in the winter, we have pretty low kind of forage abundance. We might have digestible energy, but we have few crude protein or nutrients available. As the plant starts to grow, the kilograms of digestible organic matter and nutrients increases rapidly through the spring because there's leaves. The leaves have thin cell walls, they have lots of cell contents, and the plant really becomes available and nutritious. The digestible organic matter in terms of amount will increase well into the summer because the biomass is getting greater, and then as we get into fall we just see a pretty rapid decline because as the plant senesces, those cell walls get thicker, the plants have a lower leaf-stem ratio, there might be some lignification that would decrease digestibility, etc. So now look at that graph. We've seen this several times. How does this relate to how energy demand in the animal might occur, and how does it relate to intake? To me it seems kind of not logical in that animals have really high requirements in spring, which is good, but the forage is very digestible. So the question is, do they actually eat a lot right there in the springtime when they have the highest energy demand? And the answer to that is yes, they do. But if all things were equal, animals would eat more of the plants that are highly nutritious and digestible than they would in the winter. So again, just thinking about it, you'd think animals would need to eat more in the winter because there's not as much digestible forage, not just enough digestible nutrients and energy in the diet, so they'd have to eat more of it. It'd be like us eating more celery than we do, chocolate or pasta or something that has higher energy density. But in fact, animals eat more in the spring, partly because they have more energy demand often, especially if we're talking about pregnant and lactating females. But even if that weren't true, they would eat more in the spring because they can. Because nutrients are highly digestible in the diet, and so animals can eat a lot and pass it through quite quickly, digestible quite easily, so they often will eat quite a lot more in the spring because they can. Higher nutrient value and digestible means the forage can be quickly digested, and the animals will be able to eat more, so they do. Therefore, intake usually increases as forage quality. Here's a graph from the reading that we had this week that basically illustrates this point. As forage digestibility increases from, say, 40, which is fairly low, to 80, which is pretty high, the potential intake increases radically. The animals have the ability to eat more. So even though the required intake is decreasing the amount that they would need to eat to meet their energy demands, they still will eat more because they can, because the potential intake is much higher. Another factor, now we're turning to factors that relate to plants. Digestibility was the first one. Now let's talk about water content. Early on in science, we often thought that intake might be fairly low in the spring because the plants are mostly water. Young growing forbs and grasses can be 70% water. So we often thought that high water content could reduce intake quite significantly. But that's not true. Even though there is a lot of water in plants in the spring, the animals can pretty easily process that water. So you might read sometimes in old experimentation bulletins and stuff that the amount of water in forage in the spring reduces intake. That's really not true. It might be true in some situations where there's just really, really high water. I'm thinking about watermelon or something. But most of all the time in rangeland forages, water is easily processed and absorbed. So we might have low intake in the spring. It's probably not because of the water. It's probably because of the forage available, and not so much because of the high moisture content that is in that forage. There are many forage characteristics that relate to foraging behavior. We'll talk about behavior more in this class, but those forage characteristics, when you combine them with forage behavior, can influence intake. So we know that moist leafy material is very palatable, it's very nutritious. Animals eat more of it than dry stemmy forage, for example. Forages that provide larger bites will be eaten at a greater bite rate and therefore afford a greater intake. So depending on how much forage, the stocking rate can be higher if the amount of forage is fairly high and animals can take large bites. And then, as we've talked about before in this class, plants can have anti-quality factors, which include things that reduce digestibility and other points that are toxic or create nauseousness, and therefore that could halt or reduce intake. So those are some characteristics in plants that relate to foraging behavior and affect intake. A few more points about how we as humans might interact with animals and change their intake. The main one is through supplemental feeding. If we provide forage for animals or nutrients for animals, that may change how much they need to eat on the range. What we find is that when we provide low protein supplements such as nitrogen or protein, that can really improve rumen function. So if the range is not very nutritious, it's in winter and there's not enough protein out there, and we provide some protein, that can get the rumen really going, and it might even increase intake because the rumen is becoming very functional. However, if we're in a situation where forage is really high quality and we add more nitrogen or protein to the animal supplement, then that could depress intake because they'll decide they don't need to go out and forage. It could even create problems of nitrogen toxicity. So again, in settings where forage is really low in protein, supplementing protein can increase rumen microbial activity and increase intake. Energy is interesting too. If you have low energy in the environment, a little bit of supplemental energy might help the animal meet their demands, and they might really continue foraging and give them enough energy to get out on the range and forage. However, if you get where there's plenty of forage out there and you start supplementing things like corn or barley, giving the animals more energy, then they'll just say, fine, I'm just going to sit here and eat what you supplement, and they'll substitute that for the forage that we offer them, and that will reduce their intake. And this is mostly, I'm talking about livestock settings, but it's also true when we're supplementing wildlife, for example, in the winter when we feed animals to help them through the winter. So remember, if you're going to supplement nutrients or energy to the animal, that can change how much they'll forage out on the range. So again, here's a graph from the reading that sort of shows this. If you supplement protein up to a point when there's not much protein in the environment, that can help. Once the rumen microbes get going, that can really increase or improve intake. But after at some point, then that will really decrease intake because you're providing nutrients that they could get out on the range. Energy can, for some time, increase or not affect intake, and then if you keep adding energy supplement, it will definitely decrease the amount of forage that animals eat out on the range. Another factor that affects how much animals do and will eat is just how much standing crop there is. Forage quantity can affect how much animals eat. In Idaho or in most of the West, we have fairly low amounts of forage out on the range. Generally, we'd have this lowest level, 1,000 or less pounds per acre, and so that can actually affect the amount that animals eat every day. If you get to Texas or to tropical grasslands, they can have 2,500 pounds per acre, or even 4,000 pounds per acre of herbaceous material. So at that point, there's no effect on intake. If you go from about a very well-stocked range to about 1,000 pounds, you might decline. Intake might be at a declining rate. if you get in a situation that you have less than 1,000 pounds, then you can seriously affect intake. And we might see this in range that's not extremely productive or in drought years. So we're going to talk later about this term called forage allowance, which is the amount of forage available per animal. And this is how we really try to relate forage out there related to how much animals need to eat. So next week when we talk about stocking rates, we'll talk more about that term. So basically, again, if you look at forage allowance, which again is the pounds of forage available per pound of live animal, as you increase that forage allowance, animals will start to increase their intake rate up to some point. And then this upper point is just set by their own physiology. Of course, the environment can also affect intake. If the environment is a situation where we're going into really cold temperatures, that can either increase or decrease intake. It can increase energy demand and intake. Of course, we all have higher demand for energy in the winter just because we're trying to keep ourselves warm, and animals are the same. It can also affect intake because if you have a lot of snow and ice or storms, that can really limit the amount of foraging time and ability that animals have. High temperatures can also have an increase or a decrease. You can decrease intake because animals just have less of a desire to eat and get out and forage and eat, rather stay in the shade and spend less energy in getting warm. This is actually true for humans too. You might see your own intake demand. When it's really hot outside and you're doing a lot of physical activity, we often eat quite a lot less than in the winter when we have cooler temperatures and higher energy demands. We also see changes in behavior at hot time, because we might find it at hot temperatures animals are going to spend more time grazing at night, for example, and it changes their intake patterns and their foraging patterns. Again, in the reading, there's this graph, and basically it shows that there's going to be some level of intake that would be normal intake, which would be 100%, and then we're going to talk about that at TNC, which is the thermal neutral zone. 60 to almost 80 degrees Fahrenheit, animals are in their thermal neutral zone. And so they don't really need to spend energy to reduce temperature or energy to increase temperature at that point. If temperatures are colder, animals, as temperatures get colder and colder and colder, they might start to increase their intake. We often see that when we're feeding animals at really, really cold temperatures, they'll eat a lot. The only thing that might change that is at times when there's so much rain or snow that actually will decrease intake, because animals just can't get out and forage and do their daily activities. As temperatures get hotter on the other side of the thermal neutral zone, we generally see a decrease in intake, but that might change depending on how much night cooling animals can do. So how much can they forage at night? Full moon, for example, animals can forage pretty effectively in the full moon, so that might change how much their intake is decreased. So again, the bottom line is that cold and warm temperatures can increase or decrease intake. Again, with warm temperatures, usually what we see is just a change in how much the warm temperature decreases intake. So in conclusion, there are many factors that affect intake. Many of them are animal factors, such as demand, species, and body size, and others are forage related, such as the forage quality, anti-quality factors, those sorts of things. Others are environment, such as temperature and amount of water in the environment. So in order to understand how much animals eat in any one day, and to understand how we meet that, we have to understand that forages are really important, and animals have basic yearly requirements for forage that range right around 2.5% per body weight for ruminants, about 3% for non-ruminants like horses. So those are really gross averages. We've talked about all the exceptions. In this class, we're really going to focus on those gross averages because when we talk about managing rangelands, it's all about the big picture. It's not about the small little dials that might change one way or the other. We really got to keep our eye on the big picture. So that's the main points. I'm sorry, this is just a really quick overview. But in the next section of class, I hope that we can take those basic principles about what influences how much an animal eats, and then try to think about how we might manage that as a rangeland manager.